Here is a sort of a sneak peek and both a concept and an actual what if. So, what if a website, like for example, here we're looking at FantasyoMatic. The FantasyoMatic website is a pretty standard type of website, specifically in the fantasy football world. Rankings lists where you take all the different position players and you rank them and you do some other tools. And the whole idea is that there's a bunch of data and you want to be able to give subscribers access to this data. In this particular case, this data is generated by a series of machine learning models, actually. And what if instead of having the burden of building a website with all the user interface and trying to figure out things like lists, what if instead it was a ChatGPT plugin? So, for example, what I've actually done here in ChatGPT, and this isn't exactly what the user experience would be like. This isn't the plugin interface. I'm actually in a code interpreter interface. But the idea would be when ChatGPT plugins are released universally, individuals can go into their own copy of ChatGPT and load different plugins. So let's say, for example, they loaded a FantasyoMatic plugin. What could they do with that? Well, I'm going to actually load in the entire FantasyoMatic website or the whole back end. See here, what I've done is I've loaded a zip file into ChatGPT. I've instructed it to just focus on the JSON files. You see it's doing a little bit of processing. And it's come back and it's told me, well, I think this is what some of these tables are doing. And then finally it gets down to describing it in what it calls a data frame. And it shows right here is the perfect statement for what type of thing people could do if they had a FantasyoMatic ChatGPT plugin. Player rating, rest of season rating, matchup rating, those are exclusive to FantasyoMatic. So users that have access to a plugin might be able to do things like top rated players in the current week based on matchups, analyze the best and worst matchups for the current week, recommend players with rest of season ratings, and so on. And also, and this is my favorite part, on the fly, they could generate their own articles. So instead of having a website where someone has to go on and write these articles, instead, individuals who subscribe to a plugin can just say, hey, give me a new fantasy, a week 14 feature. This is some old data, but you get the general idea. It will actually write this for you. So in this case, write a sample feature article for week 14 fantasy football season, including sections on top performing players, trending players moving into week 15, players with the best fantasy playoff matchups. And this entire thing was generated. Looks very nice, easily to read. It's got a lot of tables and stuff in here. This could be very helpful for users. And so if we fast forward a little bit, now we're actually saying, all right, well, let's isolate one of these individuals, Derrick Henry. This is a couple years back. But let's create a chart now. How about we just dynamically display the best way to tell these different stories? And with a little bit of prompting, users can modify that chart. There we have a correlation between his projected matchup rating and actual fantasy points. So we can actually see his performance based on, what these factors are. This is really where things get really interesting. So not only can people create their own charts, create their own articles on the fly, and have their own customized experience with this proprietary FantasyoMatic data. But there are some positive relationships between Derrick Henry's projected matchup rating and actual fantasy points. The correlation is relatively weak. This indicates that other factors beyond the matchup rating may also influence fantasy points. Okay, so FantasyoMatic machine learning model does not have a section in it where you can go and look at this. So instead, a user could just simply say, what are those factors? And create a report. Well, here it comes in. It says the player's position, the opponent's defense, the game script, injuries, playing conditions, and so on. Let's write an article. How about factors influencing Derrick Henry's fantasy performance, impact of the opponent's defense, game script, so on and so on. Now we're going to say, what are the ideal circumstances based on those factors for Derrick Henry to score the most fantasy points? It tells you, some of these are pretty obvious: favorable matchups, high rushing volume, goal line opportunities, positive game environment, offensive lines. These are not necessarily specific to FantasyoMatic, but then we say, all right, well, let's actually work in some of these factors based on the data that we have. You see, we have the week rating. Now we're getting into values that FantasyoMatic is providing, but then this comes up, favorability score. This is not something that's part of the FantasyoMatic machine learning model. This session within ChatGPT, or potentially a user interacting with the ChatGPT plugin for FantasyoMatic, could come up with their own score, their own completely proprietary score, a favorability score, something that didn't even exist before, which is based on the FantasyoMatic matchup rating and actual fantasy points, which are coming from the FantasyoMatic. We see a chart giving us sort of the best case scenario and some really interesting ways to look at value for a player. So then we finally say, all right, well, let's write an article about this thing that didn't exist, that this user essentially it created as an advantage for their fantasy football team. They created this just using a ChatGPT plugin or a hypothetical plugin. So here it is. What is the favorability score? How is it determined? Let's talk about the advantages of doing these things and the conclusion. So now we drill down into various different tables, and guess what? Now we're saying the top 10 performances with the highest favorability scores, season highlights. Gotta be kidding, right? The best favorability scores of the season. This is the type of experience that a subscriber to FantasyoMatic could have if, in fact, there was something like a FantasyoMatic ChatGPT plugin. They could have an absolutely unlimited potential user interface. Information that could be supplied could be completely original to them, all based on the proprietary FantasyoMatic machine learning algorithm, and really an advantage that no one else could have. So this could potentially be a revolutionary new way to interact with things that normally would have had to be in a website before. So hopefully this is an interesting example of what can be done with a ChatGPT plugin, and potentially with the FantasyoMatic ChatGPT plugin potentially coming very soon.